This video is an introduction to the African Americans and their struggle for equality in the USA. In 1916, the first slaves arrived in America. They were actually servants who were freed after a few years, but soon slaves became slaves for life. There was a large-scale import of African people to come to America as slaves, and they were not really regarded as humans, but more like cattle or possessions. The slaves were needed because they were labor force on the large cotton and tobacco plantations in the South. They were cheap workforce and they were very badly treated. They had absolutely no rights. Many people, especially in the North, where they didn't have many slaves because they didn't really need them, began questioning slavery. After the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which said that all men are created equal, people began questioning whether this Declaration of Independence and slavery could really go well together. Slavery was regarded as inhumane and unchristian. In 1808, the importation of slaves was banned and the slave trade was forbidden, but not slavery in itself. The Civil War, which broke out in 1861, broke out largely because abolishment of slavery was one of the main reasons for the war, and there was a great division between the North and the South. Slavery was abolished by law in 1865 with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. This was also the end of the Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln declared that slaves are and henceforward shall be free. But even after the abolishment of slavery, there was no real change in white people's view of the blacks, especially in the South. The blacks were segregated and discriminated against. Segregation meant, for example, that black people weren't allowed to mix with white people in public places. For example, they couldn't eat in the same cafes as whites, or use the same public toilets, or go to the same theaters, or even the same schools. Discrimination concerned both education and job opportunities, but also being deprived the right to participate in political life. For example, whites made laws which said that you needed certain qualifications to be allowed to vote, which was difficult for uneducated African Americans. Other states imposed taxes which the poor blacks couldn't afford in order to vote. Lynching was a problem, especially in the South, with, for example, people from the Ku Klux Klan fighting for white supremacy, hanging, burning, beating, killing, abusing blacks. Jim Crow laws were laws that restricted black people's freedom. For example, blacks couldn't vote, they couldn't marry whites, they couldn't mix with whites in public places, they couldn't give evidence against whites or buy or rent farmlands. So the whites did everything they could to keep privileges from black people. Segregation was actually legal until 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled that the notion of blacks being separate but equal is unconstitutional. The civil rights movement refers to a movement which happened in the 1950s and 60s. This was when blacks began fighting for and demanding equal rights for all Americans. The civil rights movement sprung from the South, but it was also in the government's interest after World War II to end this segregation, because the US being one of the chief builders of the United Nations, it was quite embarrassing to speak of human rights in countries far away when the same rights were denied in several parts of the United States. Rosa Parks was a black woman who in 1955, on her way home from work, sat in a black section of a bus when a white man entered the bus and demanded to be given her seat because the bus was full. She refused and was arrested, and this sparks the true beginning of the civil rights movement and a bus boycott. Blacks began boycotting the buses, which meant that Bus companies lost money, which again effectively meant that white people lost money. The blacks also fought for their civil rights in other ways. For example, they participated in sit-ins and demonstrations. A sit-in is a form of non-violent demonstrations, and blacks would sit at, for example, lunch counters in supermarkets or stores where only whites were allowed to sit. Their only demand was to be served in the same way as whites would be served. This caused fury, even riots, among many whites. The blacks demonstrating were beaten, thrown food or drinks at, dragged outside, arrested. But many blacks also gained a lot of sympathy for fighting in this non-violent way, and even whites joined in with them. There was also a lot of demonstrations where people demanded equal rights, and this also led to mass arrestments. The civil rights movement also led to the rise of important African American leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. is perhaps one of the most famous African American civil rights movement leaders. Martin Luther King was a pastor, an activist, and the leader of the African American civil rights movement. He preached non-violence. He felt that blacks had to fight for their rights in a non-violent way, and he admired the Indian civil rights movement fighter Mahatma Gandhi. In 1963, in August, Martin Luther King and 250,000 people met in Washington in what's known as the March on Washington. In this march, people demonstrated against discrimination and for equal rights. This is also when Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech, "I Have a Dream." In 1964, Mr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize, and in 1968 he was assassinated and killed. More than 100,000 people attended his funeral, which says something about the importance of this man. Martin Luther King and most of the civil rights movement's participants thought that fighting in a non-violent way was the right way. But there were also groups that rejected non-violent methods, like the Black Panthers and their leader Malcolm X. Malcolm X called himself X because X was supposed to stand for his unknown tribal name, the name that he had been deprived of when his family was taken as slaves to America. The Black Panthers and Malcolm X believed that they had the right to defend themselves in a militant way. Malcolm X, himself a Muslim, was assassinated by extremist Muslims in 1965. What about African Americans today then? Well, the civil rights movement has definitely changed very many things for the better. African Americans have a growing middle class, which means that more African Americans are getting good education, good jobs, and have good opportunities for a good life. They have a better access to higher education, and more African Americans have the possibility to get important jobs. Many celebrities and athletes are famous African Americans. But discrimination still has an impact, and you can still see the aftermath of slavery. There are quite a few problem areas that the African Americans struggle with compared to European Americans. For example, African Americans have more poverty. African Americans suffer from higher unemployment, greater crime rates, people who are less educated. Still, the civil rights movement has also given African Americans much more political power than before. In 1984, Jesse Jackson, who was himself a part of the civil rights movement, ran for president. In 2000, Colin Powell became Secretary of State. In 2005, Condoleezza Rice became Secretary of State. And in 2008, Barack Obama became the first black president of the United States. This is, for many African Americans, regarded as their greatest victory. If you want to know more about this very interesting topic, I suggest that you go to your textbook to find both factual text and fiction about the African Americans' struggle for equality. You can also go to ndla.no engelsk, Culture and Society, the USA, and African Americans, where you will find a list of interesting articles to read. You can also go to YouTube and search for example, Civil Rights Movement, sit-ins, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., or Malcolm X, and find information and see videos from that period. Suggestions to relevant films: 12 Years a Slave, The Help, The Rosa Parks Story, or Boycott.